welcome to the second invited talk in the series of lectures on emerging trends in research in literature. I think, research in the humanities have undergone a huge change, and in recent times it has demanded challenging of the disciplinary boundaries and breaking down of disciplinary silos. So research recognizes the complex, literary research particularly, recognizes the complex interactions of literature with other streams of knowledge, because as we all very well know, literature cannot be written in vacuum. And therefore, to have a comprehensive understanding of literature, we need to be open to other streams of knowledge as well. And literature plays a major role in bringing about a paradigm shift in existing thought patterns to encourage more inclusive thinking. And this has been clearly proven when you look at the trajectory of queer theory or feminist theory, which is extremely activist oriented. And now we have thinkers like Karen Barad, who use their foundation in quantum physics and sciences to look at agential realism and the materiality of bodies and the dynamism of forces in which all designated things are diffracting and inseparably intertwined. And this is how she even looks at the idea of materiality of bodies. So we understand that to get a comprehensive vision of literature, we need to have an idea about multiple streams of knowledge. And this is crucial when we undertake serious research. Now, to introduce our speaker for the day, Anirudh Shridhar, who's done his research on the history of mathematics, philosophy of science, politics, and modernism from Oxford University. He has several publications to his credit, and his resume is quite awe-inspiring. I wouldn't dare to read it out for you. It'll take too much time. And he's also taught as an outreach English faculty at the Oxford University. And, when you look at his resume, it reveals his diverse interests. And we couldn't hope for a better speaker to speak to us about research in the humanities in the 21st century, prospects and challenges. Over to you, Anirudh.
Thank you so much for that undeserved introduction. But I think the other bits of it I genuinely thought were actually quite revealing about how the present moment is one of strife and one of opportunity within the humanities, particularly. It's not very controversial, I think, to suggest that probably the biggest buzzword in the humanities at this moment is interdisciplinarity. Almost everybody wants to attach a certain moniker to their studies of literature or history. It's almost the way in which you make your chops in the world of the humanities, at least in the West. There are many ways to look at this. We could just sort of look at the various ways in which the humanities have been opening up in the recent past, and sort of discuss the individual areas in which interdisciplinarity has flourished. But I think that would do an injustice to the history of our discipline. And certainly it will paint only half the picture, because I think before sort of just enumerating a list of different types of interdisciplinarity that exists, I think we must ask ourselves why it is the case that scholars in the humanities find it essential to sort of big themselves up in this way, by suggesting that they're studying 19th century literature and medicine. They're studying Renaissance humanism and science. They're studying, like me, for instance, studying modernist poetry and mathematics. What was it that told me when I was applying for my PhD that somehow I would be taken more seriously if I attach the word mathematics to the study of modernist poetry? And it's true, you are taken more seriously if you attach a certain moniker to what you're doing. That comes from the sciences. So the flip side of this question becomes, are the scientists doing anything of the sort? And the answer, I mean, while there are, you might be able to point to individual scientists who have an inclination for poetry, or conferences which bring together scientists and humanists. I think overall the answer would be no. The scientists do not feel the need to say that they're studying quantum mechanics and romantic poetry. It just doesn't happen. And even if you look at the historians of science and historians of mathematics, this generally tends to be the case. The almost rare exception being Jeremy Gray's Plato's Ghost, which tries and narrativizes the history of mathematics through the lens of modernism. That's almost so extremely rare that you can almost call it a freak incident. But this wasn't always the case. In the early 20th century, you have almost unanimously, towards the end of the 19th and the early 20th century, I'm talking about very, very early 20th century, Fantasiecle Europe, you have almost every scientist falling over themselves, trying to describe the romance, the beauty, the aesthetics of science. You have someone like G.H. Hardy, the famous mathematician who brought Ramanujam to Cambridge. If you read his book, he's constantly talking about he's trying to remake mathematics in the image of aesthetics by saying that it is a disinterested pursuit of beauty. You have Poincaré in France doing almost exactly the same thing. So we have to ask ourselves what has happened in the century that has passed. To tip the scales to such an extent that the authority has shifted from literature and the humanities almost completely to science, such that we are in a compromised position where we must affect interdisciplinarity in order to find the sanction of authority. Now, this isn't going to be a talk against interdisciplinarity, quite the contrary. I mean to suggest that interdisciplinarity is the natural order of things, and the separation of the disciplines is what is artificial. But if we are to continue seeking interdisciplinarity, we must understand that it can only work as something that's viable and something that would extend the sort of lifeline of the humanities if it's done on an even footing. If it's understood that the humanities is a sort of comprehension of all human activity, science included. Right. So, as usual, as is the case when one is giving a sort of very general and loose history of things, it's customary to begin with the Greeks, and I won't be a radical, and I'll do the same. So we can look at the humanities, I think, in a restricted fashion as being literature and history. Philosophy is a kind of bastard child of poetry and mathematics, and it has always entertained a kind of devotion towards mathematics and science, and it has always remained to a large extent acquainted with and essential to the development of science itself, its own internal development. One need only look at the old departments of science in the ancient universities in Heidelberg and Cambridge and Oxford, or even Paris or Bologna. It's still called the Department of Natural Philosophy. Science is just one branch of philosophy. So I think it would be imprudent at this point to go into the history of philosophy. It's too large a subject anyway. So we'll begin with history. So the great two. The great triumvirate of ancient history being Herodotus, Thucydides, and Tacitus. We'll ignore Tacitus for now and consider the great sort of almost miraculous flowering of historical and flowering of all kinds of knowledge in every field in the 6th century, right after the Persian Wars. And look at the two sort of great epics of history written at the time. the one by Herodotus, named Histories, which is what gives the name to the discipline. And then the great classic by Thucydides, The History of the Peloponnesian Wars. So, without going into much sort of political history of the time, there are two great important wars in Greek antiquity. There's the one against the Persians, which the Greeks eventually managed to win, and then there's the war against there's the civil war within Greece. The two factions being Sparta and Athens, and these two historical works. The first one, Herodotus writes about the war against Persia, and Thucydides writes about the war within Greece. So I think in many ways these two works represent the two different visions of his historiography, historical writing. There's Herodotus, whose method, if you will, is simply a sort of collation of structured interviews, unstructured interviews that might ring a bell to people studying the social sciences today. The way basically pretty qualitative social science, the way it proceeds is simply by conducting field surveys and structured interviews. That's kind of what Herodotus did, except he did it a lot more profoundly than a lot of modern social science. And so his method did not have the sort of faintest tinges of the scientific method attached to it. He basically collected stories from around the ancient world, from Egypt to Persia to Greece, and sort of narrativized it simply according to what people said. So there were sort of monsters and demons and gods sort of interweaving their way into this narrative, and almost within the same generation, towards the end of Herodotus's life, Thucydides writes a completely contrary historical work called The History of the Peloponnesian Wars. So Greece has repelled the sort of great empire of the Achaemenids, and it's now turning on itself, cannibalizing itself, fighting against itself. And this is the next great war that Thucydides chooses to narrativize. And in the first chapter, or I don't know, it's the preface or the first chapter, he basically says that he's going to do everything that Herodotus didn't do. And he says that he's going to do this. He doesn't mention Herodotus even once. He says that people write about the nature of history as if, it's a fantasy tale, mixing in ghosts and demons and gods into it. What I'm going to do is talk about history as if I was talking about the weather, as if I was talking about meteorological phenomena. And so basically he says that I'm going to write a scientific account of the causes of this conflict and what we can learn from these causes for the science of government. So how we can learn from the events of this war, and what we can learn from it to apply to future statesmanship, to future governance, about the laws of human nature. So he can basically converts the human field into a science. And historically, these have been the two great visions of what history is. And people have, and historians have vacillated between these two poles. And so if we move a bit further, we can see that through and Tacitus, the great Roman historian, who's writing about the decline of the Republic, the death of the Roman Republic and the birth of the empire and the corruption of the great emperors before the good emperors come in the first century, he leans towards Thucydides. And then if we move a bit further down, we come to Byzantium. We have Procopius, the great historian of the era of Justinian, who leans towards Herodotus in writing secret histories about stories, and he doesn't talk about nature, doesn't talk about the laws of human nature. He veers the story more towards a kind of catalog of events and stories that are being told. So, and then we move to the Venerable Bede, one of the sort of singular great historians of the Dark Ages, who writes about the ecclesiastical history of the English people, and he veers again towards Herodotus because he's writing a series of events. Somebody was possessed by the angel and opened this abbey, and another person, God came and spoke to them, and they wrote this poem. Here's the poem for you. That's very Herodotian in his way of writing things, and so on and so forth until the modern times. People have fallen on either side of the spectrum. So I think what we can glean from this is that the two visions of history that exist are history as science and history as literature. So just to describe that in case it isn't clear. So history as a set of laws, human beings as predictable, almost mechanical creatures that behave according to a set pattern that can be studied and analyzed and divined, and history as merely the unfolding of the universe's being. The history as poetry, history as simply the sort of the great forward march of events, the great creativity of history itself. These are the two sort of visions, and you can clearly see why the Herodotian vision is closer in nature in many ways to literature than it is to what we understand to be history as a catalogue of facts. So what happens is that concurrent to this, while all of this is happening, we have literature developing in its own interesting ways. In the ancient world, literature is lyric and epic. Literature is historical in some ways because it's the first great poem of the Western canon, Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, become historical documents. The story of Troy, we have no other source for it. I mean, we have a bit from Hesiod, but we have no other source for it. So in the ancient world, Homer is a historian, he's a scientist, he's a god, he's all these, he serves all these various functions. And so you have poetry understood to be both a catalogue of facts and truer in some ways than anything else, which is why Plato in the Republic banishes Homer, because he says that people believe Homer way too much, and Homer was not a soldier, so we should not believe what he says about the nature of warcraft. Homer is not a historian, so we shouldn't believe about what he says about the different things that happened. And then, but on the other hand, you have Aristotle, who in the Poetics says that poetry is more historical than history. What he means by this is poetry generalizes. You can write about write life accounts of 100 different soldiers, but in poetry you have the character of Achilles and you have the character of Hector, and these are types, these are ideas of what a warrior is. And in that way it does what a science does, which is take a bunch of disparate phenomena in the world and then take all of them together and generalize it and create this edifice of knowledge, which is based on laws, universal laws. And that's kind of what Aristotle argues poetry does, by dealing in types rather than dealing in individuals. So these are the perhaps two great conceptions of theoretical conceptions of poetry in the ancient world. You have Plato's idea that poetry is a kind of fake history, fake science that should be banished. It's very seductive, attractive, but nonetheless it's false and therefore should be banished. And then you have Aristotle saying that no, in fact, poetry is truer than science, truer than history. and it sort of has after the Christian era, after Europe becomes Christian, poetry becomes, and I mean literature in general, just becomes ecclesiastical in nature. It becomes theological, and I think it's well worth our time to skip about 1,500 years and come to the Renaissance, when poetry begins to become almost entirely secular, where we're not mentioning a few secular poets like Chaucer, for example. So in the Renaissance, poetry undergoes, or literature in general, prose and poetry undergoes this incredible rebirth as a secular art. It comprehends the spectrum of human thought. If you read the collected poetry of John Donne, for example, you will be up to date on almost every single scientific theory that exists in his day. You will understand. You will not just get a sense of sort of practical science like marine chronometry, or how, or how to navigate in the seas, practical things of that nature. You will get the theory of Copernicus, that the heliocentric theory of Copernicus, wherein we finally establish that the sun is at the center of the solar system. We get references to the laws of Kepler. We basically have, we get references to, even in his late poetry, some references to Galileo, and we have the great sort of heroes of modern science in Kepler, Copernicus, Galileo, almost their theories almost digested and remade in the image of literature in the poetry of Donne. And this isn't exclusive to John Donne. I mean, this was just common use in the Renaissance. The ideal of the Renaissance man as one who is well versed in all the areas of human knowledge, and this is the crucial point that people often forget, he's able to find connections between the various faculties of human knowledge. So you have you have the fact that, for example, the sun is the center of the solar system, that, and the earth is now alienated to one corner of the solar system, that acting as the sun being the sort of beautiful, unattainable mistress, and the earth being the sort of the chivalric knight being shunned to one corner of the universe. Then you have the sort of the famous compass conceit, where everywhere the compass moves, it seems as if the poet and his lover are rotating, looking at each other, but then never able to get any closer. So you basically, at this point in the Renaissance, you have a language that is capable of talking about the deepest forms of sensuality in the same poem, wherein the larger metaphor and conceit is about the latest theories in science. And this did not seem strange to the Renaissance civilization. It wasn't considered as a form of interdisciplinarity, or a form of two faculties borrowing from each other, simply because these faculties didn't exist. They were, Kepler was a theologian, so was Galileo. Newton was extremely accomplished in the classics. He was also interested in all kinds of strange things like alchemy. So it wasn't the case that an individual chose to be a humanist or a scientist at this time. Now, so the Renaissance is the point in sort of Western history when this kind of ultimate synthesis of all the different forms of knowledge that hang together split for the first time in the 17th century. The 17th century is a very, very important time, because the success of science seems to have been wrapped up within the larger political and religious problems of Europe at the time. So you had the Protestant Revolution, and it was sort of wreaking havoc on Europe, and people didn't really understand what this would mean for the nature of daily life. One doesn't realize that one is living in a huge historical event until probably 400 years later. So what happened was that science got mixed up in the rhetoric of the Puritans in England, who for now we'll just call them the Protestants, the anti-Catholics, and Catholicism got mixed up with upholding the ancient order, basically a kind of reactionaryism. So the Tories anti-science, the Puritans pro-science, and obviously Protestantism always had a rank disdain for anything that is ancient or medieval. It was a very visceral hatred of the sort of scholasticism of the Middle Ages, which they felt confused matters too much. And they felt that the orthodoxy of wherein almost all of Europe was had to submit to this idea that Aristotle is the only sort of bastion of all knowledge, and any kind of challenge to Aristotle implies a heresy, entails a heresy. So at this point, the idea of banishing Aristotle from the syllabus, banishing scholasticism, medieval scholasticism, Christian philosophy writ large from the syllabus, became somehow associated with getting rid of the language of Catholicism. Now, Catholicism has always been a very sensual religion. I'm talking about after St. Francis. Before that, it's a sort of strange admixture of power and knowledge. But after St. Francis, you see in the Renaissance that the ritual of drinking drinking wine, which is the blood of Christ, and eating the wafer which is the body of Christ, and the musculature of the cathedrals, and the sort of coming together of a collective in choral music, and just the amount of meditation on the nature of the Christ suffering, which almost elevates it to a sexual kind of fantasy about pain and pleasure. You find all of this. You find these ways in which Catholicism remade the artistic imagination of Europe in Florence and Paris and England in the first half of the last millennium. You find all of this sort of bundled up and associated together in the late 17th century. So getting rid of Catholicism also meant stopping the kind of poetry and literature that was being practiced by Catholic poets, who just happened to be Catholic. So you have Henry Vaughan writing seductively about about the blood on the body of the Christ. You had Crashaw doing almost the same thing. You had Donne, who had all these salacious innuendos. So all of these things now considered sort of bundled up with the ancient world, bundled up with all that is orthodox and backwards and bad, and we need to get rid of all of this and replace all of that with a utilitarian, clear language that aspires to the condition of mathematics, wherein each word will have a significance that is almost as exact as the number 3. If I write down the number 3, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Just like that, the great sort of Puritan thinkers of the 17th century thought that language should be shorn of all ambiguity and made a utilitarian mode of communication that is a fit medium for the writing of science. So everything had to be abolished. Get rid of the Greeks, get rid of the Romans, get rid of any kind of Catholic writing, start afresh, just be educated in science and use a language that clearly communicates scientific knowledge. Now, in many ways, this is the beginning of this is, well, I mean, beginning is a very, arbitrary term, but it is one of the most salient events in history that bring us to our position today about a complete imbalance in the authority between the humanities and sciences. And it is this moment, when the two faculties split. The what famously, an overused cliche about the two cultures by C.P. Snow. Um, you have uh, in the on the one hand, you have uh, writers who wanted to use language in for beauty, for divining the briefest and most fleeting forms of human thought and human emotion, aesthetics, and a kind of non-scientific, non-materialistic sort of quarrying almost of the nature of the human soul, which we can, I mean, what I've said can be a sort of placeholding definition of the humanities. We don't need to go back to Cicero to understand what humanities are. We simply need to imagine that a language with ambiguity is necessary to communicate the most chance and intricate sort of wavelets and movements of the human soul and human interaction and human society. Whereas the study of science requires a complete ignorance about all of those things in order to concentrate on the material, what is tangible, what is observable, what is basic, what Descartes reduced ultimately to matter and motion. These are the only two things about which any knowledge, he said, can be safely had: matter, that is the physical world that can be measured, and motion, the temporal world, time. Time can be made serialized and can be measured. But other than that, everything else is just a guess. Smell, taste, sound, even at this time, touch, and all kinds of internal spiritual discoveries and an appreciation for beauty. All of these things are sort of fuzzy elements that we can't really say anything clearly about. But while that may be true, the thinkers that I'm about to talk about only came to this conclusion under the rules that they set. So that it's very important to understand this sort of bait and switch. So you change the language to something that can only communicate in a utilitarian fashion, right? A word is a signifier and the meaning is a signified. A tree stands for a tree, whatever. So once you reduce language to a scientific function of communicating a fact about the world, after that point, it is true that language cannot communicate in a very serious way about anything outside of matter and motion. But that is not the understanding of language that people before the Renaissance, people during the height of the Renaissance had. They never thought that that language is telling you truths in the way that that science gives you, like a mathematical formula gives you truths. Language is communicating laterally. It's communicating through depth. It's communicating through all kinds of explosions of ambiguity, and the ambiguous nature of language in itself is a testament to the ambiguous nature of human nature. So this was the kind of bait and switch that happened. So the important figures to remember in this are probably Bacon. Francis Bacon, in both his works, especially in the New Atlantis, which is a very often underread work, basically says he basically is. I mean, in true Protestant fashion, he wanted to abolish all idols, and for him, one of the idols that were worshipped was language. He called this the idols of the marketplace. Words used in for the effect of their sound, words used for the kind of aesthetic experience of those words, divorced from the meaning of those words, that is an idol for Bacon, right? It's as if you're worshipping. It's as if you can imagine, if you're an idolater in the European imagination, your effigy of a god that you worship in the temple is merely a piece of rock, but you are imbuing the piece of rock with divine properties, properties that are not actually tangibly there if you just restrict your understanding of truth to your senses. So insofar as that is the understanding of idolatry, you can think of language, the aesthetic qualities of language, as that same act of imbuing a physical object with supra, intangible qualities. So the aesthetic in language, that is an idol that Bacon says we must abolish. You then have you have Hobbes. Hobbes is the most intolerant of any kind of ambiguity in language. In fact, I thought I might actually read something from Hobbes for you, from the Leviathan. You see how he reduces the reach of truth here. So in chapter 24 of the Leviathan, he says, the universe, that is the whole mass of all things that are, is corporeal, that is to say, body, and hath the dimensions of magnitude, namely length, breadth, and depth. Also every part of body is likewise body, and hath the like dimensions. And consequently, every part of the universe is body. That which is not body is no part of the universe. And because the universe is all, that which is no part of it is nothing, and consequently nowhere. So, materialism in its most clear and assertive articulation. Anything in the universe that is not physical doesn't exist. He even had a very complicated way in which he made the thoughts an extension of even your thoughts, which are clearly not tangible. He made that even an extension of the body. He said that just in the way that if you look at, let's say you're looking at me now, and then you close your eyes, you will still have a trace of the image of me that you saw. Similarly, he says that any thought that you have is simply a trace of the physical matter in which you come into contact. So, right, and then he says about language. Just give me a second. Yeah. So he's talking about the uses and abuses of language here. He says, I'll just read a small segment. He says, special uses of speech are these. First, to register what by cogitation, by thinking, we find to be the cause of anything present or past. Secondly, to show others that knowledge which we have attained, that is to counsel and teach each other. Thirdly, to make known to others our wills and purposes, what we feel, to make that known to others so that they can, help us deal with it. Fourthly, to please and delight ourselves and others by playing with our words for pleasure or ornament innocently. So the last use is for him, it's a kind of plaything of children, like rhymes, nursery rhymes. So poetry is like nursery rhymes, just a kind of ornamental thing that's not really useful or profound. So to these uses, there are four correspondent abuses. First, when men register their thoughts wrong by the inconstancy of the signification of their words, by which they register for their conceptions that which they never conceived, and so deceive themselves. So the incorrect use of language, every time you use a word that doesn't belong where it does, or in the sentence, in the syntax, or when you use a word that says something more than what you mean, or less than what you mean, or different to what you mean, any kind of incompetent use of language is an abuse. So we'll come to see what he means by incompetent use of language. Secondly, when they use words metaphorically, this is an abuse, remember, this is the second abuse of language. That is, in other sense, than they are ordained for, and thereby deceive others. And then I think we can skip the rest. So here we have it, right? So an abuse metaphor is now an abuse of language. So almost the central quality of literature is an abuse of language, because you're using words other than what they're supposed to mean. So whatever, your Achilles is a lion. No, he's not a lion, because he's a human. He doesn't have a tail. He doesn't have large canines. Therefore, he doesn't have a mane. Therefore, he's not a lion. Doesn't matter that we are abstracting qualities from the lion and Achilles and saying that the lion is ferocious and the lion is beautiful and majestic and the lion is brave, and those qualities apply to Achilles. We apply the qualities that apply, and we automatically, wean out qualities that don't. That doesn't matter. You are using one word where to say something where it doesn't belong, and that's a lie. It's just, there's no point in stretching the matter further. Why? What is the purpose of this? Just don't do it. That's what Hobbes says anyway. And this is hugely influential at the time. And another important event of the 17th century is the institution of the Royal Society. The Royal Society is the collection of scientists and who basically want to make it institutional, rather than just having your random sort of gentleman, Boyle or Newton, discovering things. Let's now have a society where people can gather together and talk about science, talk about what to pursue, talk about how to carry the scientific enterprise forward. And this will also act as a challenge to classicism, historicism, and any kind of orthodoxy. So in the first meeting, I think it was the first meeting, I'm not sure, maybe it's the first meeting. Anyway, on December 7th, 1664, the Royal Society appointed a committee for improving the English tongue, okay? And for polishing the English tongue. So these are the two ambitions. Just think about that. One of the first meetings of the Royal Society to discuss the future of science. The most important thing that they're worried about is to improve the English tongue. Just the amount of fear that the pull of poetry, the pull of literature and the humanities had on the Renaissance mind is not to be underestimated, because they are trying to fight this. This is a fight to completely unmake that authority. So one can. I'll just read this in a second, but I want you to imagine that what we think of today as the humanities trying to be interdisciplinary in order to gain authority that was lost to science, to be more scientific, is the place that the humanists are in today is exactly the opposite in terms of the place that the scientists were in the 17th century. Now, they are approaching the matter in a completely different way than the way in which we are approaching the matter. The way we approach the matter is to be conciliatory, right? To show the olive branch and to science and say, look, I know that you think we're wasting our time, but look, what we do is also sometimes study what you study, and we say that there have been interactions between what you've done and what we've done, and therefore please appreciate us. Please don't treat us like invalids. The approach so we are in that weak position now against science, the same way in which science was in a weak position against humanities in the 17th century. So now just look at the way in which they approach it. So Thomas Pratt, who is recording these meetings, says in regards to improving the English language, there is one thing more about which the society has been most solicitous, and that is the manner of their discourse, which, unless they had been very watchful to keep in due temper, the whole spirit and vigor of their design had been soon eaten out by the luxury and redundance of speech. This trick of metaphors may be placed among those general mischiefs, such as the dissension of Christian princes, the want of practice in religion, and the like, which have been so long spoken against that men are becoming insensible to them. They, the society have exacted from all their members a close, naked, natural way of speaking, positive expressions, clear senses, and native easiness bring all things as near the mathematical plainness as they can, and preferring the language of artisans, countrymen, and merchants before that of wits and scholars. So, any kind of speech that isn't utilitarian is a redundancy, okay? It's a pure redundancy. And metaphors are tricks. It's a mischief, the same way that kings are tyrants, and in the same way that you have the Catholics selling the indulgences, your totems and mother. This was the girdle of the Mother Mary, and this belonged to the Apostle John. And if you buy it from me for 100 florins, then your sins will be expunged. That kind of a cheap kind of cheating of people using religious objects that is associated with Catholicism, what's generally called sale of indulgences. That is basically what your average literary person is doing. Your writer, your philosopher, your theologian is doing. They're basically selling you, they're manipulating you and selling you false information. And therefore, we need to change language and bring all things near the mathematical plainness as they can, right? Right. So, I could go on about the 17th century and the 18th century, but I think it's important to remember that the place in which we find ourselves in as humanities scholars, as people who are beleaguered in the modern times, is a function of a concerted propaganda effort amongst the Puritans in England in the 17th and 18th centuries to remake the whole of education of the European mind under the image of science, and relegate to the status of almost nonsense any kind of discourse that is humanist in nature. So without that understanding, I think it's impossible to understand what interdisciplinarity means in the 21st century. And I think that in many ways you will find that the preceding 2 centuries is almost entirely defined by the reaction against science, which went about its work in the wrong way. So, and I'll get to why I think we are going about this work in some ways in the right way, and in many ways in the wrong way. So, the Romantics. For now, I think for the purpose of time, I'll skip how the classicists of the arch classicists of the Augustan period of the 18th century dealt with this problem. We'll skip to the Romantics. So the Romantics, what they did was they said that science is murder. Okay, any form of discourse that makes the universe stable, that has a subject who is a kind of disinterested observer observing an object which is stable, is a form of the deepest mistruth about the true nature of the universe, and it is an anathema to the truth. And one can almost look at the Romantic break as one of the great sort of revolutions in thought in history, where since the Greeks until the time that I described, you had this idea that there was one mind looking at one physical reality. This is the most clearly enshrined in the doctrine of Descartes, which is the Cartesian plane, where you have the subject trying to know the object. But this is in many ways the way in which knowledge has been conceived since antiquity. You had one mind studying the world and understanding what the nature of the world is. What that nature of the world is, whether it is Christian, whether it is Platonic, whether it's pagan, whether it's sensual, whether it's scientific. There's been a lot of disagreement, but there's not been a disagreement about the nature of the subject and object. This is what the Romantics attacked, and I think they damaged it quite quite a lot as well. So what they thought was the universe is creation. It is in a constant forward-moving, energetic form of creating instability. It is untouchable. The truth is untouchable. It's fleeting. It's moving from here to there. It's jumping around the same way that our thoughts jump around, and we are as much part of that forward moving march of creation as any other part of the universe. And this shift, what it does is that it says it makes science now a form of weakness. It's you try and in a laboratory set conditions where things are stable and try and get stable truths out of it. But the universe, the Romantics said, is not stable. It constantly keeps moving, and your 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 study of objects within the laboratory is a fabrication, is a fake that you are creating in order to submit the universe to your designs. But that's a kind of blasphemy for the pantheistic Romantics. For them, the way in which you understand the universe is through myth. Okay, you had the great myths of ancient Greece. You had the great Celtic myths of Vulcan and Thor, and you had the medieval stories of the monks by the Christians. These are all ideas that transcend any kind of stability. Art is the tree of life, science is the tree of death, the famous line of Blake. In a scientist, all he can do is take a rat, kill it, and then study what is dead. He doesn't know what is alive. Whereas the poet is and the music and the opera of Mozart, these are like the myth of Don Giovanni. These are all great because they do not try and stabilize reality. They allow it to explode and create new meanings in people's heads, just in the way in which a great myth will mean something different for different people. That is the only way in which you can say anything about the universe in as fleeting a way as the universe itself is. That is how you can adequately say something about the universe. So this is the Romantic rebellion against science. They were as savage and brutal towards science as the scientists were towards the humanists a century before. But in some ways, where they were misled, the Romantics, was to completely reject the workings of science. So Newton was a kind of liminal figure. He became both a hero who was endlessly creative and also became a monster who submitted the world to these laws. But the way in which they rejected science completely was, I think, a miscalculation, because in the intellectual circles of Europe, whether they be in Germany or France or England, these Romantic ideas had a huge sort of success, and they have their afterlife. We still feel the effects of it. But on the other hand, the fact that they said that, okay, this is the language of poetry. When you're writing poetry, you talk about the meadow, you talk about the farmer, you talk about the maid, you talk about the sun and the moon and the nightingale, and you don't really talk about scientific stuff, because that stuff is anathema. This kind of almost puritanism about the nature of poetic language, that we restrict ourselves to certain subjects that have this sublime quality that I just discussed, in a way injured the history of the humanities, because while all of this was happening in the intellectual circles of Europe, while you had one after the other agreeing with these ideas, you had Wordsworth and Shelley. Before that, you had maybe before or at the same time, you had Fichte, Schelling in Germany, and then you had Hegel, for whom history itself was alive and marching forward towards some kind of apotheosis. You had Byron, you had Wagner, you had Nietzsche, you had Schopenhauer, you had all the sort of greatest minds of the 19th century, all rebelling against science in almost the same way, with more and more beautiful prose, while at the same time Europe was undergoing an industrial revolution. Uh, uh, the economic backdrop and the economic setting of Europe was completely changing and being remade by science. You had the invention of the steam engine, and um, you had a world which was practically moving towards a kind of scientific future, whilst the humanist and the academic became more and more impractical, more and more sequestered into the sort of the sort of dangerous self delusions of the ivory tower, and these forces meant that by the time the 20th century hit, truly you had a case in which the humanities were completely divorced from anything to do with science, except philosophy, of course. But in literature and history, you had this romantic reaction against science meant that the moment at which the humanities were asked to defend themselves as what is your purpose, what is your use to the reality of civilization, they had no answer, because all they'd been writing about for a century was about the Greeks and pastoral life and farms and a bygone form of social organization. The pastoral, basically, that is what they'd been writing about. And whilst this was happening, society had completely remade itself, and it looked entirely different in the early 20th century. It looked like the modern day. It looked industrial. So what have you contributed to our understanding of human beings in this world? They had no answer, and therefore, whether it be history or literature, they had to remake themselves again, and they looked back to John Donne as their model. To metaphysical poetry in the 17th century as their model. What they decided was that now the humanities, right now, we're getting into what is recognizably our past. If you belong to the literature department, this is definitely the birth of your discipline, because the early 20th century is when you started having English departments in Europe. I mean, you had them in India under Macaulay's program in the 19th century. But that's just to create a class of bureaucrats that the English would communicate with. But literature as a discipline only came up in the 20th century, and they're influenced by such thinkers as Eliot, I. Richards. You had a kind of revival of the metaphysical ideal of having what is it, the famous line of Eliot, wit at the tip of the wit at the tip of emotion, or tip of the tongue. Something like that. So you basically wanted scientific ideas to be made sensual, to be made in some ways within the province of literary discourse. And a lot of modernism can be described in this narrative, because they immediately felt that the kind of bucolic pastorals of the 19th century just will not fly in the 20th century, and they remade poetry into a kind of busy language that's constantly referring to scientific theories that are being they're remaking Einstein in the image of Newton as this kind of romantic figure, and they're trying to include in the poetic diction all the sort of squalid uglinesses of modern society, which the Romantics had shunned. So you had the pylon poets who were talking about, cash registers and electricity poles. You had some of the great Cambridge poets, Michael Roberts, William Empson, who were trained in mathematics and physics. Jakob Bronowski, Kathleen Rain, trained in biology. So they became poets, and they constantly weaved in the latest scientific theories into their poetry. And you also had the new criticism, which it gets a bad reputation because because of this sort of dogma that the new historicists shunned history. But actually not at all true. I. Richards, who is considered the founder of New Criticism, he wrote this famous book called Science and Poetry, which basically makes a lot of the arguments that I've been making today in a different way. He says that poetry reorganizes just in the way that science reorganizes physical matter into a definable law, which can then be broken back into phenomena. Poetry synthesizes all the sort of messiness of life into these terse formulations, these metaphors, which can then reorganize one's life and remake one's internal constitution. So, interdisciplinarity, in many ways, was the buzzword in the modernist period. It's nothing new. It just simply didn't take off, alas. And a lot of people blame New Criticism for it because they made poetry this kind of aesthetic, unbreachable whole that cannot be penetrated. A poem is a kind of religious object, as it were. But that's something that maybe some of the Southern agrarian poets in America did, like Tate and Ransom. But certainly Cleanth Brooks, who was the American originator of New Criticism, he just didn't bring in historical factors when analyzing a poem because he thought that he didn't have space in the book. I mean, the publisher gave him 200 words, 200 pages, and he thought, okay, I want to say a lot about how to interpret poetry, and I can't be doing that if I'm constantly flitting back and forth between the historical period and the poem in question. So it's just I think it's just a legacy of the failure of the Romantics. That's the cause. I think in the public consciousness, the humanities still conjured up a sensation of elitism, of irrelevant irrelevant rhapsodizing about scholastic texts from bygone ages, an obsession with the ancients, and these are all just things that just didn't seem to. These are all prejudices or cliches about the humanities that just didn't die down. They just the modernists failed in the force of their argument and their poetry to make a case that in fact the humanities can work together with science towards some form of truth. And in many ways, the modern chaos that we find in the discipline. We left actually the story of history behind. So we can maybe resume that story in the 20th century. So we can say that in some ways, critical theory that was born in the 70s with the great sort of French thinkers Foucault, Derrida, the post-structuralists Roland Barthes, who come from who draw their ideas from sociology. In fact, their argument was twofold. Now, we can talk about what they overtly said and how they were styling themselves, maybe unbeknownst to themselves. So post-structuralism, critical theory. I'm using these words interchangeably. So on the one hand, you had this idea that you need to bring history back into the study of literature because history is what is objective. And it was a reaction against New Criticism, or at least reaction against a cliche about New Criticism that had developed by the time, and in many ways they helped to create. On the other hand, their style was Marxist in that they viewed the study of humanities and language as something that should be made scientific. And this was classically the gesture that Marx had made in the 19th century, where he thought that history is simply materially determined, and therefore same way in which we study the material history of rocks, we can study the history of human societies and the development of it just through economics. So basically critical theory is born with these two so the ideal being the Marxist ideal of converting their discipline into a science, the way in which Marx converted the discipline of economics into a science, and then on the other hand, to reject this aestheticizing tendency of new criticism. These are the two factors in play. So the development of critical theory becomes in many ways a way in which to assert a kind of Gnosticism, a kind of elitism that they were overtly perhaps trying to argue against, but nonetheless one which would place them pari passu with the scientists. So the scientists are using these inconstruable words, quantum quarks, and red shifts and relativity, and whatnot, string theory. And so we will do the same thing. We will, talk about post-structuralism and post-Marxism and post-Marxist feminism, and these all become theories, basically. And theories, there are no theories in the humanities. This is the first time that there's a theory in the humanities. I mean, Marx had made a theory about history and a theory about economics, but now almost every aspect of humanistic study becomes part of a theory. And this is nothing but attempting to seem scientific. A form of accruing authority to oneself that makes you think, okay, the scientist is talking about things in completely incomprehensible ways. Now we need to talk about things in incomprehensible ways in order to seem extremely, seem like we know what we're doing and seem like other people can't do what we're doing. So in many ways, it doesn't really make a departure from what the romantic ideal was, which was that you need to separate the sphere of the humanities. It's just continuing that struggle between the humanities and the science is just another chapter in that long fight that begins in the Renaissance, and then that this stuff, the critical theory, it sort of blows out, and people within within academia just lose interest. It loses steam, and it's replaced. America being the center of cultural power at this time, it's replaced by an American named Stephen Greenblatt, by new historicism. That the way in which we can compete with science is not by coming up with fancy theories, but by reducing our subject to what is objectively fact. Right? If you recall, we'd begun the discussion by talking about, well, not begun exactly, but a while ago we had spoken about the fact that the Cartesian or the scientific worldview of the 17th century was that all truth should be reduced to what is objectively fact, right? What is physical, tangible. And this was their attempt at undermining humanistic inquiry as being something that is fuzzy and intangible. Now you have exactly that in literary studies. You have new historicism, which basically argues precisely that. It says that there is no point in doing close reading. There's no point in looking at any of the looking at it semantically, reading poetry or reading literature semantically. The purpose of literary criticism is to reduce the whole edifice of humanistic thought to what is material. Okay, to what you can get from factual documents. You go and read the letters that he wrote to his grandmother. You go plumb the archives and look at the laws that were being passed at the time. Take anything that you can touch and get your hands on. This is now fact because this is historical, and anything that is intangible is now shunned. And this is ultimately I would call it the complete submission of the humanities to the ideals of the Royal Society in the 17th century. It is a complete, total capitulation to that. And it doesn't stop there. I mean, it just gets more and more materialistic. So you have the Stanford Literary Lab with a kind of newfangled idea that somehow computer programs are going to tell us more about literature than a close reading of a poem, simply because um, the discipline has already surrendered to the idea of the scientific method. According to science, the only way in which you can come up with a theory about a phenomenon is by repeating the same experiment 1,000 times. You look at the same event over and over and over again, and you look at as many events as you possibly can. If you're a biologist studying flamingos, you go and study every single flamingo and you observe them, in their habitat. And any scientific theory that's based off of one observation is obviously defunct. But that's not how it works quite in literature. A study of Empson says that he studied Sonnet 94 for 20 years before understanding exactly what it meant. This is just not the way in which it works in literature. But because the discipline has capitulated already to the scientific ideals of Locke and rather Bacon and Hobbes, what happens is that now, because one individual cannot study all the texts that were written in the 19th century, therefore, that individual cannot say anything about the 19th century. But the computer can, because the computer can process big data and churn out information about what are the words that are used in the 19th century. How are these ideas going up and down along with historical moments. I haven't the time to go into the details about how 5-gram vector analyses work, but they basically collapse their arguments on how many times a certain word is repeated. Basically, so if you have the word madness repeated 1,000,000 times in the 19th century, then there will be a paper that comes out that says that the 19th century was obsessed with madness. It's basically that simple. But nonetheless, it has the veneer of something that's technical, right? Because you're using programming. And that is how you sell yourself in the 21st century as somebody of note or somebody worthy of what it is that you're pursuing. So, and the same thing happens in France in the 20th century in the School of History, in the Annales School, where you have, to be fair, it's some of the greatest historians that I've ever read. I could not do without Ferdinand Braudel. But nonetheless, the historical discipline completely changes from the kind of myth history and classical philology of the 19th century to now a scientific enterprise. So they become the sons of Thucydides, and the French school basically, you have the 3-part history of capitalism by Braudel, which is so involved in insignificant things that it's almost a masterpiece because of its obsession with insignificance. He begins with how bread is made. Okay, that's the level at which he takes the history of capitalism, and then the history of bread, and then we get the history of wine, and then we get the history of furniture. So basically, again, history completely surrenders to the scientific ideal, and all future forms of historicism are exactly that. And you have the what if history of Neil Ferguson, which has become quite popular recently. Basically, what he asks historians to do is treat history as a scientific experiment and say, if you tweak one event, if let's say England hadn't signed the treaty with Belgium, how would the Second World War have gone? Something like that. And he says you need to test your theory of history by doing thought experiments in this way. So pretty much history is now considered a form of science, just in the way in which literature is considered a form of history now. So in that way, the hierarchy has built up towards science, and the way in which we're going about it, in some ways, this talk was a long-winded way of me saying that pursuing interdisciplinarity in this way will get the humanities absolutely nowhere. And because what it is it's a form of life support, right? In the hospital, you get plugged into life support. Um, and you're completely at the mercy of the doctors. In the same way, you basically are saying that there is no unique value that humanistic inquiry can have, and you're putting yourself on the life support of things like sentiment analysis algorithms, which tomorrow will be forgotten by the scientists as being a defunct program, but which today happens to have some cachet. And that form of parasitism, wherein the humanities become a kind of parasite that are sort of feeding off of the success of the sciences, is no way in which to pursue interdisciplinarity. But the positive trends have been what we might call new formalism in the literary studies. You have people like Susan Wolfson, Isabel Armstrong, Derek Attridge, who are encouraging this kind of mode of looking at formalism through a historical lens. So basically, in some ways, going back to Cleance Brooks and I. Richards, saying that what we need to do as literary critics is try and appreciate the genius of poetry and try and communicate the meanings that are created in it to other people. But we do it through the study of form. Now, form is something that can be studied in a quasi-scientific way. You can look at the formal features of a poem. You can look at the way in which they develop. You can have theories about them. And so on and so forth. Another thing that's happening is that the discipline of the history of, the discipline of literary studies has become it's becoming more and more clear to the literature and science field, if that such a thing exists, that historically almost ours is an exclusive, exclusively ignorant time when the great writers, the sort of famous writers, have no, or people in the humanities have no real acquaintance with the sciences, because historically all the great writers, were very, very well acquainted with science, including the Romantics, to the extent that Coleridge thought he had improved the theory of Newton. Goethe thought he had improved the theory of Newton's theory of color, and so even even the historical period in which the thinker, the humanists, the writers who were most hostile to science, even they were extremely well educated in science. And now more and more it's becoming clear in the humanities that this division is a very division between the faculties, between the humanities and the sciences, is a very fleeting and a very short historical episode, and that's almost relegated to the second half of the 20th century, and that any form of humanistic inquiry, whether we look at the historical text or whether we look at today's world, will involve a kind of broad understanding about all the aspects of societies, and science being an essential and important one. And that the way to go about interdisciplinarity is, in fact, to basically just do what everyone was doing historically anyway, which is to submit the forces of history, science being a very important one, to the modes of humanistic inquiry that we have available. I think, with that, I'll stop and open it up to questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Anirudh. So, Biju, how can we do this? Do you have the questions? Can you see the questions, or?
Should I look at my chat or something? Or?
Is Dan there?
I can read.
Yes.
Yeah. Please, Dan, read a few questions.
Yes, sir. So shall I start reading it?
Yeah. 1 or 2 questions then. Yeah.
The first question is from Nipin Nath. Academically, we are in the buzzing exercise of multidisciplinarity, but epistemologically, truth, that mathematics once tried to arrive at is still the truth, whereas in humanities, the truth has turned to post-truth, para-truth, and sub-truth. What sort of commonality or method will then, sir, help us taking up interdisciplinary research on mathematical truth and humanist post-truth?
So, I mean, the mathematics and truth is a very fraught combination, and I wouldn't say that epistemologically truth that mathematics once tried to arrive at is still the truth. That's not the case at all, because historically mathematics has been the mode of human inquiry that's least secure about its relationship with fact. It has a firm epistemological relationship with the nature of correctness. Now, I think we need to separate these terms out, because fact, correctness, and truth are very different things. And for Plato, mathematics was occupied a separate realm that wasn't even related to the world in which we live. So there is no circle in our universe. It is only an idea that exists in the mind of the mathematician. I mean, just as a very simple example. I mean, we can even talk about the most simplest of mathematical objects. What is the number 3? I know that there are 3 pens, but I can only identify 3 with 3 objects. But what is the number 3 on its own? We have no idea. There's no such thing that exists in our universe. It's merely something that we have to assume that exists in order to, when I say we, I mean mathematicians have to assume that the number 3 exists in order to do their work. But there's no guarantee that it does. It might just be a kind of fiction that the human mind has invented because of the way in which we're wired. And this is something that was a huge problem in the 19th century when mathematics and physics split as disciplines. Remember that mathematics grew up in the modern world alongside science. They were just, I mean, Newton invented calculus in order to prove, some obscure theory of his. It only became a separate discipline in the 19th century when mathematicians began coming up with theories that have no application in the physical world. So non-Euclidean geometry, for instance. All of physics had been grounded in classical mechanics, which is grounded again in Euclidean geometry. But now suddenly you have vector spaces, and you have shapes and spaces that behave nothing like the world that we experience, and that in some ways, apart from very mundane things like funding and university funding and things like that, and also the Napoleonic Wars, but I won't go into that stuff, led to the separation of the faculties between mathematics and physics. Now, this created a huge problem for mathematics because people could easily suspect a mathematician of just creating the same kind of fancy that a poet does, building castles in the air, because it's not connected in any way to the physics, to matter, to what became understood as truth. So the early 20th century mathematical philosophy, beginning with Russell and Whitehead, and including such figures as Hilbert, Gödel, and Leopold Kronecker, mathematical philosophy in the 20th century can be defined as an attempt to make mathematics true, because the truth of mathematics is called so violently into question because of that split. And they had to settle with the fact that they could never do that, because the attempt by Russell and Whitehead to ground mathematics in logic failed. It was undermined by a young prodigy at Cambridge named Frank Ramsey. And then you had the attempt to create a formal system that mathematics is like a game of chess, where you don't ask, whence came this power of the knight to, move left and 2 squares forward. We don't ask that question because it's just a rule. We follow it, and then everything else seems to work. So mathematics is like a chess game. It's a formal system where we don't know what these objects are. We don't know what a square is. We don't know what the number 5 is. But once you assume that these things mean these things, it all seems to work. Now, Gödel, with his famous incompleteness theory, undermined that possibility, and he said that you cannot prove the consistency of a system from within that system. There's a famous, statement. This sentence is false. If the sentence is false, then it's true because the sentence is false. And if the sentence is true, then it's false because you're saying it's false. And therefore, if you have one statement like this in mathematics that cannot be true or false, then the truth of the whole thing cannot be proven. So you basically, modern mathematics is not secure in its understanding of truth at all. But nonetheless, it has authority. I think we need to change the language in which we speak about the faculties, not as being one about truth or fact, but as being one about authority. I think that's the only thing that matters. And so this idea about post-truth, para-truth, and things like that are, I think, a dangerous sort of language game. The nature of truth is either called into question everywhere or nowhere. And these are political things that have to be dealt politically. And when we talk about epistemology, it becomes a more complicated game. And I think the reason that the disciplines are enjoying different forms of success is a function of how they've done their propaganda, how they've curried for authority. And I think that's where I'd like to limit the discussion about the disciplines. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Susan. Can we suggest that the shift or fading away of poetry in the 17th century is also due to the growth of literacy, reading, and the print? That it is not necessarily just to get rid of Catholicism or Catholic poets. In short, the transformation of poetry into prose is a product of the technological changes.
Oh, yeah. So I wasn't talking about the fading away of poetry, and I wasn't necessarily taking a dig at prose either. I was talking about the change in the texture of the language. Now, the Gutenberg Revolution, all it does is that it allows us to disseminate works to a larger extent, to a wider audience. It doesn't have any effect on the nature of the language itself. The poetry did not wane or die out in the 17th century. The 18th century, you had the Scriblerius Club. You had many great poets in the 18th century who had immense cultural authority. The language of poetry changed, and the language of prose changed as well. I think there are many theories about why the novel becomes more successful than the poem in the 19th century. Things to do with the rise of, and that also has a lot to do with the Protestant Revolution. You have the Protestant work ethic. You had this idea that you have an individual relationship with God, as opposed to the collective Catholic consciousness. And that idea of Luther is that you had an individual relationship with God and that you could read the Bible in the vernacular entailed the fact that your interiority became more complex, because now the deepest spiritual thoughts that you had were ones that you had with yourself in an internal dialogue, and not in the collective through song and through through admiring architecture. In some ways, the sort of courtly poetry and the minstrel poetry of the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance is a popular mode of communicating religious ideas. You had, your morality plays that used to go around to villages where the uneducated could come and watch these parables of the Bible being enacted and learn more about what was considered knowledge back in the day. So my point isn't so much about the difference in success between poetry and prose. My point is about the way in which both prose and poetry change at the level of language, wherein words no longer have that sensuality, that sort of evocation through sound and ambiguity that they did in the 17th century. As we move forward into the 18th century, you had, even amongst poets, remember that Abraham Cowley, the great Restoration poet, and Dryden, in fact, were members of the Royal Society. They were members of the first stage of the Royal Society. So they also wrote in their literary manifestos that we should change the language of poetry to make it more physical, more material, more rational, less ambiguous, and so on and so forth. So we're discussing it at the level of the texture of language rather than at the level of genres of literature.
Thank you, sir. We have time for just 2 more questions. So this question is from Dr. Beena S. Nair. She's asked, "Sir, science also finds itself in a dead end, with uncertainties of quantum physics which lead to a similarity with spirituality. And many IT companies are hiring candidates with imaginative, critical, analytical skills, which again contributes to innovation in the field of science. Hence, CAFE's system of combo courses like English literature and computer science is becoming a recent trend in some universities. Could you comment on these possibilities?"
Well, I don't know to what extent people in IT companies contribute to the innovation in the field of science, but there is a sense in which physicists, if you speak to them, they will tell you that they're quite surprised about how little progress they've made since the 70s. And I think that has, I would recommend Fashion, Faith and Fantasy, the recent book by Roger Penrose, where he basically argues that this has a lot to do with funding. The people who in the 70s argued for string theory did a very good job of popularizing string theory, and now all the funding goes to people studying string theory and not any other possible models of the universe, when in fact string theory, in order to make its mathematics work, so basically it uses Riemannian geometry on Feynman diagrams to basically model the it's almost like a tube structure, and you need to use Riemannian geometry to model that. And in order to do that, you need to assume about 25 new dimensions that aren't available to observation. So you're right in that physics is leading to spirituality, although the word spirituality is so vague that I don't really know exactly what you meant by that. But in a sense, physics is becoming medieval, in that it is moving away from the ideal of the 17th and 18th centuries. This happened with Einstein itself, this trend in physics to become less and less materialistic and English in its physics. So you have a situation in which, in order to make the theory work, you need to posit 25 dimensions that you can't see. And the whole point of physics is that of the scientific revolution is that you can only you have to restrict your knowledge to things that are tangible and visible, right? Material objects. So that's the problem in string theory. At the quantum level, we have similar problems of not being able to observe what is exactly going on, and it becoming a kind of mathematical development of sorts, like a language game in itself. So I think if that's what you mean by spirituality, then maybe. But I mean that doesn't in any way, I think, affect the authority that science holds in the public imagination, the reverence that scientists seem to have accrued to themselves, and the funding that they're able to get for their research. So these are the reason I suggested we should limit it to a discussion about authorities, because these are very practical, on the ground sort of scenarios that we're discussing. That the fact of physics not having progressed in 30 years could be due to a lot of things. It could be, due to the way in which physics has become a collective enterprise. The recent Higgs boson paper had like 1,000 co-authors. That's just not how revolutions in physics work. Historically, if you look at great revolutions in physics, they've always come about because of one random mind of genius. They will have influences from other thinkers, but at least that's how Thomas Kuhn and the Structures of Scientific Revolutions describes it, as being the progress in science being the work of genius and maintenance in science being the work of lab coats. So I don't think that has any effect whatsoever on the authority that physics enjoys. English and computer science, I think it's a waste of time and a sort of waste of resources. Simply because I would highly recommend reading this paper by Nan Da. I don't know if can I type in this chat. She's a brilliant academic in the literature department of Duke University, and she's basically completely destroyed this notion that that sentiment analysis programs that basically work on a very basic Bayesian theory of you have two poles, positive emotion, negative emotion, and you attach vectors, as in like words, to positive and negative poles, and then you submit a massive corpus of literary works from the 17th century and say that the metaphysical poets had more positive emotion than negative emotion. Okay, well, that tells me absolutely nothing about literature or how poetry creates meaning. So I think on the whole, if you read Nanda, I think you'll be quite convinced that English and computer science is almost a complete waste of time. There are minor ways in which it can help, but I don't want to go into that now. I think we're running out of time.
Yes, so we have just time for one last question. It's from Neha Tiwari. She's asked, theories generalizes everything, but no human experience can be common. Do you think that literature, fiction, should be used as the way to reach out to reality?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Yes, sir. Theories generalize everything, but no human experience can be common. Do you think that literature or fiction should be used as the way to reach out to reality?
I'm not quite understanding what it means to reach out to reality. What's I forget her name. What was it? Can you ask her to clarify? Neha. Can you ask Neha to clarify what she means by reach out to
if
reality?
Neha can raise their hand, I will unmute them.
Dan, if she's not available, let somebody else.
Okay, so if anyone would like to ask any questions, please raise your hands and I will unmute you.
Yeah, some live comments or responses. Dr. Vinod, would you want to make a short response, or are you there? Yeah, why don't you, please?
Thank you, Anirudh. I've been listening to this fine discussion where you have been trying to talk about how knowledge as a system has been built over a period of time, and how we could cultivate an academic response, or we could relate academically, very professionally, with the kind of knowledge systems that we have built, and the concerns that we would be able to draw from the available field. But my concern is if we have to guide a scholar or point somebody to a field that would be relevant, say 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I thought we are staring at a a paradigm which would actually be shifting faster than we can imagine. And I am concerned about how the available knowledge that we have would enable us to make quick turnarounds, or as as an institution, be able to point scholars to fields that would be relevant. I'm not even looking at 5 years or 10 years, maybe 3 years relevance, 2 years relevance. So what is the shape of the humanities? I'm sounding a little apprehensive, a little pessimistic here, but I just want to know from your understanding of, and a fabulous understanding of this, the convergence of science and the humanities. How do we point us, or in which direction would you point a scholar in the humanities?
So I think what I was trying to say in a veiled sort of sense was that the situation does not look good, and I would not be surprised if in 50 years the humanities did not exist, and that all the departments had been abolished in favor of like IT and tech science. I wouldn't be surprised even if physics as a discipline would die away. And I think this kind of materialistic trend is something that can only be fought against by the humanities. But what we shouldn't be shy of admitting is that we are in a sort of extremely we're in a beleaguered, moribund state. We're dying, and the only way in which to conceive of your work as somebody in the humanities is as a fight. And I think that as a conflict, there's a clear conflict, and a large proportion of humanistic enterprise in the last 20 to 30, well, maybe even 50 years, has been an attempt to pretend like nothing is going on, pretend like everything is good, and I think I would call historicism like the dominant mood of the humanities in the present. And I would say that historicism, especially the neutralism that it affects, is probably the most dangerous thing, because it pretends to be something that's neutral, something that cannot be argued against. It's not as radical as theory was. It's not noisy. It's just something that people can sort of lead good lives, kind of just poring over, archives and doing sort of sweet nothings and writing these history books that absolutely no one is ever going to read, and getting funding from this source and that source, constantly complaining about the fact that funding doesn't come, and that's one way to go about it. And I think that's it's almost certain that will lead to the end of the humanities. The other way to go about it is to learn from how science fought the battle in the 17th century, how they were victorious by seeming relevant to the public, by being confident, and also by understanding what it is that is unique about humanistic inquiry, and what other kinds of knowledges that are probably endangered or extinct, which can only be gotten from the humanities, and making sure that one is asserting that at the forefront, and in any work of the humanities, suggesting that this is my organon, as Aristotle used to call it, right? Or organon is the method of inquiry, and also it's the word we have for our bodily organ. So that's how vital he conceived of it, and our method has to be unique, distinguished, and able to extract modes of thought and knowledge that cannot be arrived at in any other way. These three things have to be asserted by everybody, not directly, but in the way in which they do their work. And interdisciplinarity can just then be a function of the fact that the world about which we write is deeply colored by science. And one cannot, in good conscience, ignore science the way the Romantics did, in order to say something useful about the modern world. That's how I would say. The only way to conceive of the situation is to recognize the fact that you are in the middle of a fight.
If you will, if Thomas would let me, and if you will also let me join you and extend this discussion, maybe by about 30 seconds, I thought I would, and this is how I look at it. It's like we have in the universities, in the academy, across the globe, cultivated a kind of language for communication, which is sort of, we have insisted on a certain form for the communication so that communication is facilitated. But what exactly has happened is that language itself in the humanities has hit a kind of a plateau that everybody is speaking like everybody else. And so it's a kind of an incestuous situation, which in biological terms is not going to give you a eugenic breakthrough, or a healthy breakthrough. So I thought we probably, come to a point of a cliche where there is a lot of tiredness in the communication, because it's quite predictable when somebody starts communicating. You know where they're getting at, or you're able to at least predict where they come from, and so what is the logical end of a particular discussion. And I don't think one must be banking on this trajectory for the future of the humanities. I thought we need to maybe, think of a singularity situation or a conciliant situation. And while it is still interdisciplinary, it should probably be the kind of a combination of interdisciplinarity, which is a little different from what even we are thinking. Maybe we are trying to paraphrase interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity in terms of the disciplines that are there, but are we also factoring the disciplines that are not there? And do we have that enterprise to bring them into the conversation, thereby breaking the crust of the cliche in the communication? And there I would maybe, take something out of what you have spoken about, these extraordinary minds. The extraordinary mind is one that can sort of break the cliche with ease, and then it can sort of set a trend, or it has the momentum of the genius to draw to itself the following. So I thought that is not happening in the humanities. We have very talented scholars, articulate, professional scholars, but this outstanding talent that can draw, something like a Shakespeare. You started with Homer. Somebody like that. I thought we're still waiting for that person who can symbolize the next singularity moment or something like that. So I thought the future probably lies in that kind of a moment.
Possibly, but it'll have to be by someone outside the discipline.
Yeah, fully agree. Thank you, Anirudh.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for the comments as well. I thought they were well measured.
So, Dr. Priya and Dr. Biju, can we end it, or would you like to say something, or what is going to happen? Biju, are you there? Can we stop now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, let's conclude.
Dan? So you want me to? So okay, now I think.
Now,
in fact,
Thomas. Yeah.
okay, go ahead. You.
Yeah, Thomas, please come forward with a few words of gratitude to Anirudh.
Yeah, of course. Honestly, I don't want to, because I don't want to end this discussion, and I don't want to. I don't want to allow Anirudh to go away. So I don't know what to say. One thing is that Saint Paul says, listening to Anirudh, the old man is peeled away, and the new man is born. So it's a kind of baptism by fire. So I'm almost unmade, and I hope many of you are in the same mode. He simply pricked the bubble of interdisciplinarity, and many people, wear this badge, not knowing what it is all about. And I think he has rightly, asked us to look at this badge. What does it mean, actually? I'm really confused. If you look at the syllabi, the researches, where is our university? It's a place of dialogue. But actually, there's no dialogue. Now, what all mimicries we do in the name of dialogue? We have cafe system, and we have Raviel system, we have Tally system. I don't know, we come with so many vocabularies, and we are simply defeating ourselves. Now, Anirudh, I cannot thank you for this talk. I mean, I think this is a talk you should recommend to students who do research, who want to do research. And I think, guides who are guiding. So, and I should say that you rightly continue what Sanil did yesterday about the idea of amateur and the idea of divine violence, and the idea of the instantaneous felicity and so on. And you are actually saying the same thing. So who will listen to this? Now UGC is coming out with a lot of reforms, semester, this and that. And where are we going? I don't know. So that's why. So as I said, to say the least, like I'm undone, as Dan says, I'm undone. So you have really, hit, and it's high time we see the chaff from the grain. We cannot go on like this. Our researchers are defeating humanity. And when I say this, it's better not to do it than if you don't do it well. And I'm a bit emotional in this, saying that if you don't do it, you haven't at least done it. But if you do it for the sake of doing it, I think the quantification, promotion, this and that. So we need a genius to come up and to say the most. I don't know if I'm babbling, and I'm saying that I'm really indebted to Anirudh for making us see something like a guru, who opens up the eyes and clears the darkness that we are in. And it's very important that we should realize we are in darkness. Otherwise, how can we do research? So I think it's not enough that you give one lecture, but you have to give a series of lectures on this. And I think the question is like, how many of us have the mettle? How many have the stamina? See through this broad canvas. Some people get easily upset. Why do you start with Greek? Why do you start with Homer? No, we want to work with large canvases. We have to work with, history. We have to work where we started, where we are, and so on. But people, Vinod wouldn't be angry if I say people want to do research as if they make vada and dosha, like in 6 months, 3, 4 years, 2 years, and they want to name it interdisciplinary. And that is the most dangerous thing. If you do something in their own discipline, it's okay. But they want to make it interdisciplinary, and they want to finish everything in 3 years. Now, how can this happen? I don't know. I'm really, as somebody said, we step in where many people fear to tread. So interdisciplinarity is something, a long way to go, I think, as far as we are concerned. And like Anirudh, like somebody, put so much of time in this, like an amateur, pursuing knowledge, or probably it's some sake and not for a promotion associated. Anyway, thank you. I'm sorry. I was just a bit ecstatic about what you did. And so thank you for this conversation, opening up this conversation, opening up our eyes. And so that definitely we will again get together to talk about this, before it's too late. Thank you. And I think all of you will agree with me. if I don't know if I'm properly representing everyone's feelings. Maybe I may be wrong. I'm so I'm just saying that we all should be grateful to Anirudh for this tremendously enlightening talk. And thank you, Anirudh, in the name of all. Let's meet again in some forum again. Thank you, Anirudh.
Thank you. You're too kind. Too kind.
And thank you also to other conveners and all the participants. And some participants, I think, left early, but that's okay. But that's what research is all about. Some people leave early. But as I said, so if somebody is asking, what is the challenge? The challenge is to fight. Now that he rightly said, we need to fight rather than conform. And beautifully said that we are on life support. We are getting some kind of palliative, some kind of patronage from some scientific, some scientific discipline and so on. So we should fight and find our way and see our way, find our own way. Thank you very much, Anirudh.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Much obliged.
Thank you, Vinod, also for the
thank you, everyone.
conversation. Okay. And thank you all the participants.